Thank you. And thank y'all for showing up. Wow. Yeah. What a crowd. And that's when I hollered, fire! I used to go back and tell my wife, I said, well, I was the youngest one in the room, but I can't do that anymore. You know, but I really appreciate y'all coming out for this. And what I'd like to visit with you about, since we're in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and talking about the American Revolution and all that, is the Revolution happened right here. You know, this country in here was very much a part of it. We think of all the battles at Trenton and places like that, or Camden, but it's going on right here in a different kind of way. And that's what that story really shaped what became the state of Tennessee, for instance, and Western North Carolina and all that. So I'd like to share that with you in sort of some personal observations from work that we did 39 years ago at a place called Hiwassee Old Town. Hiwassee Old Town, if you just get on 411 and drive 6.5 miles to where the bridge is over the Hiwassee River, that's where Hiwassee Old Town is. So it's very local. They sneaked Polk County in there, so it's not quite McMinn County, but pretty close in there. You know, just down south of Delano. And so Hiwassee, this place is it's an Overhill Cherokee town that actually gives its name to the Hiwassee River. And the actual word is Hiwassee. And it's been translated as savanna, like a meadow, like a savanna. It's probably not. That's not the word for savanna. But that's why that place is called Savannah Farm, and that's called the Savannah Ford, is because of Hiwassee Town. And English speakers would take Hiwassee, and it ends up as Hiwassee, but pretty close. So this is a place that we know about in part from the documentary record, but in part from the archaeological record. And I'm an archaeologist by profession. As I tell people, I said, that does sound like the start of a 12-step program. But working at Hiwassee Old Town was really the first big project that I ran way back. And then really had to assemble something about the history, the story of this place, which is what's remarkable about it. So we're part of the Overhill division of the Cherokee people, right? The towns on this side of the mountains were referred to as the Overhills. And we know of Hiwassee from the documentary record throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. The last of the Cherokee people living there, that last occupation was in the early 1820s. And that land was ceded, to the United States in 1819. We'll come back to that. But during the first part of the 18th century, this was a big flourishing town that was really active, and it shows up in records of the trade, both the English and the French. They're kind of playing off each other there. And then it just disappears. It just goes away from the documentary record. We don't know why. There's not a written record of that. But it sort of disappears at a time when a big smallpox epidemic had hit, and Cherokee people are locked into what ended up being a 45-year-long war with the Upper Creek people. And the thing about the towns on the Hiwassee River, they were the frontier. That was the edge of everything of Cherokee town settlements. And so when push came to shove, we think they pulled back away from that. So the town gets abandoned. And then it gets reoccupied. I'm going to tell you about that reoccupation. Except not go backwards, forward. But people come back out there in 1756. And this is, right at the, kind of in the throes of what they call the French and Indian War, and the English are establishing the forts up on the Little Tennessee. And it's a pro-French group of Cherokee folks who come from Great Hiwassee. And they reestablish there. And at that point, it becomes Hiwassee Old Town, because it's not the same organization of people who had been there before. And it was just a little place, just a little place until the time of the American Revolution. And that's when it really comes into focus and becomes this really kind of flashpoint on the Cherokee frontiers then. French knew about it. This is a 1717 map. They don't label much stuff, but they do, in a very French kind of way, label Hiwassee. Early English map, 1721. This is a Barnwell map, and they call it Hiwassee. But that's them hearing Hiwassee there. And you can see the census from that same year, 1721, there's about 140, about 200 people out there, living out there in those bottoms. And a town that would have looked sort of like this. It would have a big council house, and then domestic residences all around there. This reconstruction doesn't have nearly as many cornfields as it would have. There would be corn growing everywhere at that time, because it took about a half acre of corn per person to support a town like that. So a town of 200 people, they're going to need to be growing 100 acres of corn out there. And Hiwassee is one of the few places around that you can do that. Of course, you get down here in the Tennessee Valley, there's all kinds of places. Up there in the mountains where we are, you have to be real particular about where you put a town. But these towns would have looked like this, and they sort of shifted from place to place up and down the rivers. This is a kitchen map, and they're talking about a situation in 1746 where it says the French are coming all the way up to Great Hiwassee, bringing bateaus up there to trade. So they're going toe to toe with the English in this trade there, and so it's always this place on the edge that's contested. The French and the English, the traders show up in town at the same time. Nothing good's going to come of that. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. The creeks are always in and out. The Muskogee people are always in and out of Hiwassee. Right? Yeah, there it is. Great, and they spell it Hiwassee there, because at that time everybody, it's like it's a wash rag, right? They put an R in everything. Now this very dim map, I'll show you, that's from 1764. This is John Stewart's map. And there, it's gone from being Great Hiwassee to Hiwassee Old Town. And that's that interim where the town gets abandoned and then it gets reoccupied. And that French allied faction, there's also both French and Muskogee people who are involved in this resettlement there. The Great Mortar and the Wolf King of the Muskogees come up. They have something to do with this. The English is driving them crazy, because this is like, the enemy's got their foot in the door there, and they're going to try to woo all the Cherokees over to the French side. So this is a real problem for the English, but it's not a big problem because there's only 30 men there, according to this census that goes along with that map. So it's a little small place. That reoccupation was less than half of what it was originally. And at that time, 1760s, 1770s, it would have been a scattered town. If you went up in there, you see the same kinds of houses, but by this time people have horses and cattle and hogs, and they got peach trees growing around, apple trees. There's all this stuff that is very different from what it would have been in 1717. So this is, Cherokee folks have adopted all these things that are really useful, from the English. And at this time, they're feeling pretty good, right? The Cherokee folks, especially over on this side of the mountains, are really pretty protected, at least from the English, not so much from the French and their allies. But so they're in a sweet spot here, and they feel particularly protected with the proclamation of 1763, the Proclamation Line. And this is something that comes on the heels of not only the 7 Years' War, but Pontiac's Rebellion. And here's to highlight that proclamation line. They can see that there's a problem on the American frontiers. And the problem is because all these settlers, English, German, Irish, all these folks, want to get on all this land, right? And that's causing a tremendous amount of friction with the indigenous people who are already here. It's like these lands are already occupied. They're already owned. It's already, very clearly under kind of common law who has it. And King George is trying to tamp down this, and they issue this proclamation 1763, which draws a boundary on the edge of the colonies, a boundary of expansion. These lands, it says right there, lands reserved for Indians. It's everything west of the Blue Ridge, west of the Blue Ridge Divide. From there on, it's supposed to be reserved for the original inhabitants who hold the principal title. And King George is going to guarantee this. This is one of the reasons the American Revolution starts up. King George has said, you can't go over there. And people like Daniel Boone says, hey, here, hold my beer. Hey, y'all watch this. To the main feature of the American Revolution, what we're seeing by the 1770s, there are all these people violating that proclamation line. They're just pouring across this. Upper East Tennessee, all the way into the central valleys of Kentucky and Tennessee, they are just pouring across here. There's private deals being made, so what's called the Transylvania Purchase. It's bargaining away all these Cherokee hunting lands in Kentucky. And it's old guys like me, Cherokee leaders are like, yeah, throw some more trade goods on there. Y'all can go settle out there. But the young warriors, people like the one that we all know about, the dragon canoe, it's like, no. Because what's happening is the basis for the Cherokee economy is a deerskin trade. So Cherokee folks and most of the indigenous folks in the interior are hunting deer for hides to sell to the English, that the English are bundling up and taking to Great Britain and making everything, because this was the plastic of the day, right? They needed leather. There's not enough leather coming out of either the British Isles or the continent to supply everybody. So all those little cute white knee breeches that the British soldiers are wearing, those are made out of doe skin. Those does are getting killed in Kentucky and shipped over. All of that stuff that's American deer hide, and Native people are the jobbers who are extracting this and getting trade goods. These traders are coming in with pack horse loads of goods. It's like having Walmart come to your town, right? Bringing everything in, and people are really dependent on this trade. That's where you get guns, that's where you get blankets, that's where you get axes, that's where you get kettles, that's where you get glass beads, that's where you get everything, is from the deer. Now you can imagine, you're going to hunt out the deer where you are. You've got to go farther and farther and farther and farther away. And Cherokee hunters, along with Shawnee hunters and Chickasaw hunters and Iroquois hunters, are all coming together and amazingly not shooting each other in Kentucky. And what happens? Daniel Boone moves in. Is Daniel Boone there to grow corn? No. Daniel Boone is there to kill deer, to sell them the same way that Cherokee hunters are selling them. In fact, we know, the Shawnees captured Daniel Boone about 3 times. And he lived with them for a while and escaped. What they would do is he would go on a hunt. He'd get about 100 deer skins, or maybe 200 piled up, and they'd wait until he had all his deer skins, and then they capture him. They take the deer skins away. They hold him hostage, and then they say, let's look away and let him get away. And then he'll go get more deer skins. And we'll get the deer skins from him again and again and again. They called him the old fool. But what happens, they move in, just like there's people moving into the Tennessee Basin in the midst of these hunting grounds. They've just moved into the bank. It's like inviting Willie Sutton in to the bank vault. They've moved into the bank and they've started pillaging. This is a huge problem for Cherokee folks and other indigenous folks on the west side of the proclamation line. King George said, you can't do that, you can't do that. And of course they ignored it. The American Revolution breaks out. 1775 breaks out for any number of reasons. Mostly in the Northeast, but also down in Charleston, down here in the South as well. And these guys are mixing it up. Now remember, most of the traders who are working in Cherokee towns and have Cherokee families, they also have other families down in Charleston, but they have Cherokee families. Most of these guys are loyalists. They are loyal to the crown. So now Cherokee folks have all these relatives who are loyalists. And in fact, their number one relation who's royalist is a guy named John Stewart, not the talk show host, not the Comedy Central guy, but a guy named John Stewart, who was called Bushyhead, by the way, and he had been adopted by Ottakokola. And I don't know if he'd been given clan or what, but he was recognized as a relative. And so when he gets put in charge of the Southern Indian District, he's the superintendent of the Southern District, appointed by the Crown. This is like, hey, we're golden, our guy's in there, right? Committees of safety in Charleston say, we're gonna grab you and we're gonna tar and feather you and run you out. He gets out in front of them. They actually grab his deputies, Thomas Brown, and they do tar and feather him and scalp him and leave him for dead. So now these guys have attacked your relatives, right? And at that point in time, Cherokee folks, even though that Stewart and Cameron and Brown have all been saying, look, you guys just sit back, just stay cool, don't get in this. They're like, we can't put up with this, right? So, and there's these other problems like Daniel Boone, William Bean, all these guys out there squatting on Cherokee land. So, midsummer, 1776. Now, there's already been expeditions in South Carolina, not directly against Cherokees, but what they call a snow campaign. They go to Fort 96. They capture all these people. They capture all these loyalists. Well, those guys have names that end up as Cherokee family names, right? These are people who are already married in among Cherokee folks. And so there's already been aggression now on the part of the Americans. Cherokees consider these guys to be rebels. They are unruly insurrectionists because they're very, very law and order kind of guys. And they go to punish them, and they raid settlements that are across the proclamation line in Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky, and then some to the east of the proclamation line too, in South Carolina and Georgia. And they're led, really kind of directed by this guy named the Dragon Canoe, who becomes the principal leader in the Cherokee Wars that ensue after that. But they see this as a police action, to kind of, These are bad children, they need correction. And that's what they do. Harsh correction, though. They undertake a series of raids that just sweeps across what are in the American frontiers. And, they attack forts, outlying farmsteads. They're killing people. They're taking a lot of hostages. They're taking a lot of livestock because, remember, Cherokees are all about horses and stuff like this, and there's some nice horses right there. Getting those along. And they figure there's not going to be a lot of blowback from this because what are these guys doing? It's a bunch of just like ragged guys who've decided to go toe-to-toe with the most powerful army in the world, that is the British Army. They got this going on in Boston, they got it going on in Charleston, but how can they possibly win? I mean, the British have just basically conquered the world at the end of the 7 Years' War. And Cherokees and lots of other indigenous folks are like, yeah, we're with them, because they're guaranteeing our rights to our lands. So they're trying to vacate. Cherokee folks, and there's Mike Crow doing his business, they're trying to basically clear that region west of the Proclamation Line. Just get out of here, Terrorize people, make them leave. What could possibly happen? Well, just a little while later, colonies or states, or they're kind of in between colonies and states at this point, of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, they all hatch out a plan to put together expeditionary forces against Cherokee people and against the entire Cherokee Nation. This is going on at the same time that up in New York, they're chastising the Six Nations. It's going on simultaneously with Sullivan's Raid. They're trying to just shut down everything that's going on the frontier because they don't want to be fighting a war on two fronts. They don't want to be fighting British over here, British allies back behind them, and then loyalists right in the middle. And, from this distance, right, from this remove of time, it looks like, the Patriots go out and they've got the side of right and they just take over, and here we are now. It was all in question. It was all up in the air. Everything was up in the air at this point. South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, a little bit in Georgia, organized these campaigns against Cherokee folks, starting in midsummer of 1776 and going right on through the year. And they're sending whole armies in to attack towns. So you get, in North Carolina, this is a map showing a Rutherford expedition, which people seem to get real worked up about in western North Carolina, the Rutherford expedition, but you have Rutherford in North Carolina, Andrew Williamson in South Carolina, Samuel Jack in South Carolina, or in Georgia, and William Christian over here. William Christian's from Virginia. And the idea is they're going to hit everybody all at one time. And they're doing it in midsummer because part of their plan is all these guys have broadswords, and they're going to chop down all the corn and starve everybody to death, those that they can't find to kill outright. So the idea is, as William Drayton, who was a bigwig, you can see his big wig there, in South Carolina, and you can still visit Drayton Hall if you go down to Charleston, right? His orders that he's given is cut down every cornfield, burn every town, take every Indian as a hostage, as a slave, and they will belong to you. So guys are signing up to plunder. And his plan is that the nation be extirpated. He basically wanted to annihilate the Cherokee Nation. Not a police action, just wipe them off the map. July 1776, these Georgians go out and they get to the upper Chattahoochee and burn those towns. And just as soon as he's done, Williamson's South Carolinians come up in what's called the lower towns. So this is up above Clemson, right? Seneca, South Carolina, up in that area. And they just rage over these towns, burn all these towns. Typically what happens is everybody knows they're coming. I mean, these guys can't hide. You know, there's 1,800 of them, for God's sake. You know, so everybody's like, well, here they come, and they count everybody up, and they say, we need to get out of town. And so everybody's back away from the town, except the people who can't move fast enough. And those are some sad stories. And they're back up in the hills watching this happen, and which is exactly what the Americans want. They don't want to fight. You get hurt when you do that, you know. What they want to do is destroy the towns, destroy the crops, and starve these people to death. And that's what they do. They come in, they burn these towns down, they chop down all the corn, they chop down all the peach trees, they chop down all the apple trees, they catch a few pigs, make some barbecue, get all the horses. If they can run down any children to take for slaves, they do that. But for the most part, there's not battles. There's not open battles. There's a few skirmishes on the way, but not big battles, because these are overwhelming forces that are coming in, and people are getting out of their way. So, you know, Williamson comes in, destroys the lower towns, and he's supposed to meet up with Rutherford, Griffith Rutherford. Rutherford has brought 2,400 guys, mostly mounted riflemen, and they burn all the towns around Franklin, North Carolina, and then they start across the mountain to the area around Murphy, and that's where they meet up with Williamson, and they just sort of finish off the valley, what's called the valley towns there near Murphy. So all these guys together, you know, east of the mountains, they destroyed 36 towns, you know, like 2/3 of the Cherokee towns. They destroyed 36 towns, more than 5,000 acres of corn. They're cutting down all the orchards. They're cutting down apple trees. In some places, they say ancient apple trees. And capturing people, taking captives, taking horses, take these back home. So they have just laid waste to the eastern portion of the Cherokee Nation. The only thing that's left are these towns that are over here on the west side in the Tennessee Valley. And so they've destroyed all the food. There's nothing to eat for folks, and there's no place to live. And so everybody is just fleeing ahead of these expeditions. So you get the folks from the lower towns, they flee over, you know, in South Carolina, they flee to the towns in North Carolina. And then the next thing you know, here's Rutherford, and they've got to get out again, and they come across the mountains. They come over here to what's called the Overhill towns, mostly up on the Little Tennessee River, right? And the Overhill towns that's really what they recognize as being the political and military strength of the whole Cherokee Nation, is the Overhill towns there. You know, that's Chota was then recognized as sort of a capital city. So everybody's coming over here because there's stored food, there's crops, and you know we can survive here. So the population of the Overhills doubles or triples. Actually, it triples in just a little while. And it's people from North Carolina, people from South Carolina, people who are actually speaking different dialects from each other, people who have different material traditions, different food ways. So all of a sudden, everybody's piled in there together. They're going to winter it out in the Overhills, and then turns out that William Christian and the Virginians, you know, they've been, you know the joke about how many Virginians it takes to change a light bulb, right? It takes 2 of them to make cocktails, and it takes 3 of them altogether. You know, 1 changes the light bulb, and 2 make cocktails and talk about how much better the old one was. That's being said, it took the Virginians a long time. They're supposed to be on this program in July. And they don't get here till October, right? But now all Cherokee folks, or the vast majority of Cherokee folks, are there. And here comes Christian with 1,800 troops. And they're like, oh my God. Well, they're coming in. Dragon Canoe is at Big Island Town, local. And he is a head man mostly of Cherokees from South Carolina, Lower Town Cherokees. He's put up as kind of the head man of that. But he said, let's fight them. Let's pull together what we've got, set up an ambush, and we'll get them, we'll take them. And the old guys were like, no, that's a bad idea. We need to ask for peace. And so Christians coming in, they come in through, kind of through Kodak, Tennessee, and then down, right along the western wall. They bypass Maryville and come down to the Little Tennessee River. Now, almost all of the towns are on the south side of the river, right? They're arriving over there, and everybody has just gotten out of there. What he says, what William Christian reports back, is they'd shut their doors. Some people hadn't even bothered to shut their doors. They'd gotten their clothes and their household stuff, but they didn't take any food with them. And most of them apparently jumped in canoes and went down the Tennessee River. The women and children and old people, disabled people, they'd prepared for this, and they had canoes. They went down the river. They not only go down the Little Tennessee River, they go down the Big Tennessee River, and they go all the way to Chickamauga Creek. And that's where they pull up, and they're going to set up there. So they go there, but the men don't. The men head south. But just to give you an idea about what this destruction is like, they're burning this stuff, these unoccupied towns. They do spare some of them because of negotiation, but he's saying there's 40 or 50,000 bushels of corn laid up, 10 or 15,000 bushels of potatoes, sweet potatoes at that point. They're talking about this enormous store of provisions here. They're supposed to see Cherokee folks through the winter, the entirety of the Cherokee Nation. What he found, they stayed around till December and ate all the food, is what the Army did, because they wanted to say they'd done something. And then Christian says, all the people in the towns packed up and fled, and those that did not go down the river went to the Hiwassee River, where there was a town on the path of the creeks. That's Hiwassee Old Town. That's where the Dragon Canoe took all the able-bodied men. And they said they were setting up, as they said, fences for defense. They were going to make a stand there at the Hiwassee River against this army. And Christian said, nah, we don't need to go down there. We don't need to press our luck. There's plenty of pigs and corn and stuff right here, and we'll just sit here and eat it. So, as stuff calmed down and really, through the winter into the next year, people began to filter back into their old settlements. But the hostile faction, led by the Dragon Canoe, go and they establish a whole new set of towns down toward Chattanooga called the Chickamauga towns. And you see in the American documents after that, they refer to the Chickamaugas, this faction, which they distinguish from other Cherokee folks when it's convenient. Sometimes they're like, well, they're all Chickamaugas, let's burn them all. But, sometimes it's convenient. So Dragon Canoe goes down there after going through Hiwassee town. And Hiwassee grows and grows and grows during this period from all these refugees coming through. This is the beginning now of the long revolution for Cherokee folks. So we think of the American Revolution as it's we all think of 1776, but starting in 1775, right? And the treaty that concludes it is 1783, but most of the fighting is done 1781. So we think of it in that span. For the Cherokee folks, it goes on and on and on and on. It's not over until 1794. So you have whole generations that grow up knowing nothing but warfare, nothing but being attacked, nothing but having to move, nothing but having their homes burned down, because this happens over and over and over again. What we think of as the American Revolution and our struggle as a nation, to break away from the British Crown and establish ourselves as an independent republic, is nothing but an ongoing, just rolling calamity for indigenous people, and particularly for Cherokee people, because and I'll show you how that goes on and on. So for the first time after those expeditions, there's a major cession of land that's forced by basically conquest. That's the first time Cherokee people have ceded any land due to conquest. It's always been through agreement previous to that. But they had to cede all this land in the upstate of South Carolina, mostly the lower towns, mostly the homes of the people who were with the dragon canoe. Now, Virginia militia goes down and they actually hit those Chickamauga towns again in 1779. Burn 11 towns, burn all their supplies, and not only all their supplies, but all the great new stuff that they just brought up from the British in Pensacola, because now they have to go to Pensacola for supplies. They had all the firearms, all the gunpowder, everything they needed to resist, and the Virginians come in and surprise them and burn it all. They're barely able to get out of these towns and save their families. And where do they go? They go to Hiwassee. They go to Hiwassee. So all the Chickamaugas come over to Hiwassee in 1779, which makes them a target then. In 1780, latter part of 1780, another Virginia expedition comes down, and they're aiming, as Arthur Campbell, the commander, says, "I wish first to visit the vindictive part of the nation, mostly settled at Hiwassee and Chestoy," which is also on the Hiwassee River, and distress them as much as possible by destroying their habitations and provisions. That's his aim. His target is Hiwassee. And he writes back to Thomas Jefferson to give him a big report on how they did, right? He said, "We got to Hiwassee and surprise, there was nobody there. So we just burned it down," right? And the people barely got out. We tried to surprise Chestoy, and they barely got out, and so we burned that down too. He said they'd left all their farming implements, all their furnishings, their horses, their cattle, their hogs. They barely made it out of here. And he reports that these towns, and meaning Hiwassee and Chestoy, he expected to have been contended for with obstinacy, because most of the Chickamauga people were there. So most of the hardcore, hostile folks were there at Hiwassee. And then he reports that they didn't stop at Hiwassee. They destroyed Chota and Sitico and Tuskegee and Chilhowie and Toccoa and Mealoqua, Coyote, Chattooga, Tellico, Hiwassee, and Chestoy. Burn them all down. Burned 1,000 houses, 50,000 bushels of corn, everything. Just everything was all wiped out. And of course, this happens in December, late December. You're not growing any more food now for months. It's only the food that you have stored up, so there's nothing left. And the Raven of Chota said, the rebels attacked us in such numbers we couldn't withstand them. They dyed their hands in the blood of our women and children, burned 17 towns, I can't count those out quite, destroyed our provisions. Our families were almost destroyed by famine this spring. That's exactly what Campbell intended. That's exactly what he was doing. So, 39 years ago, right at this time, I was out up to my hips in some pit feature at Hiwassee Old Town, leading excavations for the Tennessee Division of Archaeology. Because that place, which had been in agriculture for lo these many years, had been purchased by the Division of Forestry to construct a new tree seedling nursery after the one at Rose Island was flooded. So, and they knew this was a big major town site. And so they wanted to do some kind of investigation in advance of that. And in retrospect, it was really pretty limited because it was an amazing archaeological complex out there. But they were going to level, they were going to do all this land leveling and destroy all this stuff. So we were charged with trying to find and look at things from 18th century Cherokee town. And we found buried deposits of stuff that was 9,000 years old. People lived there ever since. But we were focused on the 18th century Cherokee town. This is what it looks like now if you're familiar with the tree seedling nursery out there, and you've probably driven by and seen signs for it, right? This is an aerial view. That really lush green part there is a preserve that was set aside. So the core of the archaeological site is there, and we didn't look at that at all because they were going to set that aside. It also has a big, at one time, a big Mississippian period mound, so stuff that was 800, 900 years ago out there. So the whole town there. So we didn't deal with that. This is what it looked like. This is an aerial from 1985. It looked basically like this from the air in 1987. And I don't know if the Chilhowie glider port is still down there, is it? Yeah. I mean, the whole time we were working, there were gliders coming over. They were trying to figure out what we were doing out there. But also got some great photographs. This in particular, they tried to figure out what was going on here. There were rumors that it was signals for aliens, that we were starting a worm farm. That was one of my favorites. What we had done there is we had plowed transects, 10-foot wide transects on regular intervals so we could go along and do surface collections and figure out how things were distributed out there to try to identify where was the 18th century Cherokee component that wasn't in the preserve. And we found it and a whole lot of everything else as we were out there. And we isolated a number of areas that we stripped the plows on. So soil that's been plowed is churned up. It's like muddy water. You can't see anything, right? So we took that away. They brought us a backhoe. We had to learn how to use a backhoe. I'm not even 30 years old at that point, and I'm out there, but you have all the confidence in the world even if you don't know what you're doing. And we didn't have, we had money for a few people who were trained archaeologists, but mostly we were hiring local folks and training them as we were doing that. So, we stripped off these areas that are over houses, cleaned them all off, shoveling. Now, look at the weather records for 1987. It was 103 degrees in July out there. And we ended up with these excavation areas that are over 18th century Cherokee house areas. I'll talk with you about those for a little bit, but we have some just lovely aerial images there. You can see where we are at the gap of the mountain. Fighter jets from Manchester would come flying through there so low you could see the guys' faces, and they'd wave at us and we'd wave at them, and then they'd turn sideways and go up through the gap of the mountain. Here's our, actually most of our crew, not our whole crew, working on hand excavation of one area. And here's some of the local McMinn and Polk County folks undertaking their cleaning off a big pit feature. So at this time, Cherokee folks were digging lots of pits in the ground to store mostly sweet potatoes, because that's the best way to store sweet potatoes is down in the ground. So there are big pits all over the place. When you get done with the pits, then you've got a big hole out in the yard. You know, you step out at night, you're going to go pee or something, you fall in the hole. So you want to fill those in with what you've got, which is trash. So these are dumpsters, and archaeologists are just dumpster divers. That's kind of what we do, right? So this was great. This was the very stuff. You see all those little orange spots? That's plaster from the sides of houses, burned plaster from the sides of houses. All the soil that we dug out, we screened through window screen, or we did flotation samples to recover all the really fine and delicate materials. That's me. I was really skinny at that time. We all were back then, right? So when I say we uncovered remains of houses, what we uncovered were the post holes. You can see these are houses that are built on post frameworks, kind of like a pole barn, right? And that's just a sketch of what one of these might have looked like: a house, yard, little corn crib area, pits outside. And these were scattered across the field. You know, it's a widely dispersed community. One of these was this morass of post holes that we were trying to figure out. The little black spots are where posts had been in the ground. The larger spots are pits that were around. Some pits are inside houses, some pits are outside houses. Turned out that what was going on there is there was one house that was built and burned, and apparently some of the posts were still standing, and they thought, these are too good to waste, and built another house using those same posts turned sideways. That's why it's this kind of big T-shaped. But it was the burning that was interesting. That house still had the stubs of charred posts, and the pits were full of plaster, full of daub. Like that piece, you can see the split wood impressions on it. And when I say full of daub, like 600 pounds of daub. It was the whole house dumped into this pit. And all this other burned material, and all the pits were full of burned material. Whole hickory nuts burned, not broken and burned, just burned whole. Whole peaches burned, charred, thrown in the pits. All this stuff, masses of glass beads melted and fused together. This, by the way, that's what these houses would look like. They had 3 compartments in them. They're actually they're about the size of a single wide, segmented out into rooms, covered with clay plaster, you know, nice weatherproof roofs on them, and you can see the posts in the ground. That's those post frameworks we're talking about. One of those pits had a whole set of turtle shell rattles, leg rattles, thrown into it that had burned and thrown into the pit as they cleaned everything up. They cleaned all this stuff up. And in some cases, the sides of these pits that had been opened, had been storage pits, right? And they cleaned all this up, and sides are burned. Stuff went in hot. As people cleaning up after a burning episode. It turns out this was everywhere across there. There's another house, a little different style of house, a little shorter, 2 compartments. Just something kind of like that, right? That's just to give you an idea of what it would have looked approximately like. You can see the larger house and yard. There were pits around full of garbage. Some of it was just regular household garbage, but some was stuff that had been very kind of hastily disposed of, burned, right? These are big pieces of pottery that are down in that pit. More pottery. Like I said, we love these things. You know, we're dumpster divers, I admit. One pit was full of corn. Not just a little bit of corn, a whole lot of corn. Like people were roasting the corn down in the ground, and somebody let it get too hot. There was a big rock weight that had been on top of it, and it had turned red and burned its way all the way down to the bottom. And there were intact ears of corn around the sides and ashes in the middle. And you can see, it's not a very good photo up in the right. I was used to seeing like little corn cobs like that. This looked like Funk's hybrid. These were ears of corn this big. And we were like, oh my gosh, what do we do? Because that's not, you don't run into that sort of thing. How do you recover that? Turns out it was the largest single deposit of corn, archaeological corn, ever found in the eastern United States. In there. The whole thing was burned. So we recovered all of the ears we could in aluminum foil, so it kind of looked like we'd just taken them off the grill, right, to keep these cobs and ears together. And then the rest of it was dug out in masses, and we did what we call flotation processing, where it's gently put through agitated water and floated off the top and caught as, in really fine mesh. The state of Tennessee worked on a shoestring at that time. And so our catchment for these things were pantyhose seconds. We had a big box of these pantyhose seconds. We've been using them, but there's one pair we had been saving. And they were hot pink, XXL. And we hooked that thing up and we filled it completely with corn. We've got some, I didn't put in a photo of that, but so something happened that this whole pit full of corn burned. And something happened that these are horse bones. And they've been butchered. They've been cut up. That poor old horse got eaten. Cherokee folks didn't much eat horses. Cherokee folks didn't eat horses, period. That's something that people learned from the French did, But that was not on the menu for Cherokee people, except as starvation food. And we know from an earlier account from 1760 that when people had been burned out, they were obliged to live on horse flesh and roots out of the woods. It's seen as a famine food. We're seeing famine here. That's what this is. That long pit there was a little cellar that was up in the floor of a house. And there was a bunch of daub on top of it, and then charred deposit in it. And what that charred deposit was sweet potatoes. Now, they're little guys, how they shrivel up when you leave them in the oven too long. It's full of sweet potatoes. Again, the largest deposit of sweet potatoes recovered from an indigenous site in the East. Why did they burn? How did all this stuff burn? It's capped by daub from the house. This is part of the destruction episode. Remember, Christian said they destroyed like 15,000 bushels of sweet potatoes. There's another pit that was under one of the houses, again, probably used to store sweet potatoes, but that didn't have the destruction deposit in it. What we're looking at here is evidence of the Campbell expedition, because it happens in December, and all the foods there, the stored foods, it's a spoiler. There's some other expeditions coming, right? But they don't get there in time when there's going to be stored food. They come there in the summer. This is when everybody has all their food stored. And Campbell comes in and he burns it all. You're seeing the physical evidence of this expedition. It raged into Hiwassee town. Since that time, we've actually found several other town places that these expeditions hit, and we see the same pattern repeated over and over and over again. If Campbell's talking about burning 1,000 houses, that's the main part of the archaeological signature of these towns, is where it's the revolution. It's the evidence for the revolution. Now, archaeologists love pottery, right? I keep telling my students, you got to love this stuff, right? And I have to convince them. But here's why. I know it all looks the same, right? But it's not. So that pot up there on the very top, that's kind of a milk pan. That's a new form for Cherokee folks. It's shell tempered. It's got little pieces of mussel shell in it, right? That's what folks on this side of the mountains did. All of their pottery, everything they made, 98% of the pottery they're making over here is shell tempered. So we just call it Overhill shell tempered pottery. But half of the pottery at Hiwassee was not shell tempered. Instead, it's tempered with sand or grit and stamped. That's what you see back over in North Carolina. That's what they're doing in North Carolina. That's what they're doing in South Carolina. This is the pottery of refugees. This is the evidence of the refugees actually being here and doing that. And then you get stuff like that plain jar, because all the Overhill stuff is plain, it's not stamped. You get that plain jar and it's grit tempered, just like this. So it's like people making pottery that looks like Overhill pottery, but they're making it in the way they know to make it. You know, when in Hiwassee, do as the Hiwassee people do. Be a good guest, and then that's what they're doing. So we see just this evidence, not only of these massive attacks going on, but also the effect of refugees being forced from place to place to place. And this has, ultimately a seriously transformative effect on Cherokee people in this long revolution. I just show this again because I love pottery. There was also trade goods, stuff that had come from the English, mostly. Things like gun flints and lead ammunition. That's a hammer from a trade musket there. Everybody wanted this stuff, needed this stuff, right? To hunt with, to fight back, to do this sort of thing. But there's not much of it out here. Nothing like what you would see in a town site from 10 years earlier. It's just really impoverished. And that's because these folks, by 1780, they'd been under a trade embargo for 5 years. Including this, just little tiny scraps of silver jewelry, right? There's a ball and cone earring, there's the cone from a dangling earring, and there's my favorite, see the little triangle with a hole in it? That's a nose bangle. So you'd have a pierced nose, and at that time we never, 1987, we'd never seen anything like this. Now you just walk around, people got holes all over the place. But you have a pierced nose, and you have a little ring through that, and then you have a little ring through that, and then you have that little triangle sitting there right on your lip, right? And then it's turned out where everybody can see it, and it's great until you get a cold, right? But it's there. But everybody had those. Everybody was wearing this, men, women, maybe children, through that time period. And that's like one of the markers you say, this is during the American Revolution. Bam, just like that. And then, just sort of domestic goods around, like that's a piece of a brass kettle, there's a wrought iron nail, there's a wine bottle neck, and an axe that's worn down to nothing. So if you're in a situation where you're under a trade embargo, you wear everything out. And so again, more evidence of all this stress that's being heaped upon these people over what ends up being almost 20 years. Back to our friend John Stewart, who loved to make maps. He just loved to make maps. He did different editions. This is his 1781 edition, after the Campbell expedition. And what does he show? Right in the position where Hiwassee Old Town was, it's a different name. He calls it Little Guodo Conahit. I don't know I need to ask my friend back here about Guodo, what that's about. And we don't know if he's just trying to hide the name of this place. Hello? Or why he does that. So he just puts a different name on this place in this same location on the map. But notice also he shows the Chickamauga Chickamauga village down there as well. So the survivors come back after Campbell. There's a hard starving time there. Rebuild, everything's going along good, and then here comes John Sevier, one of our fathers of Tennessee. John Sevier comes riding in with his militia in 1788, and he surprises them. For the first time, they get jumped and surprised at Hiwassee. And there's actually a fight there. Now remember, the treaty between Great Britain and the now United States has been settled in 1783, but this war doesn't stop. This war just keeps going. But now it's turned into sort of local conflicts. It's almost like gang violence going on at this point in time. And by this point in time, they all recognize each other. They know who each other are. They see, they're like, oh, there comes John Sevier. They know him. John Sevier knows what the dragon canoe looks like, And actually, one of my favorite episodes that happens real close to here is John Sevier takes his soldiers after they destroy this town, and they decide to go over into the valley. And they come in over what's now the Unicoi Turnpike, and they drop into what was Kutlow town. And everybody gets out of their way. They chop down the corn, they stay there, and they're going to go up the river to Notley town, and they're just riding along. They think they're all good. There's 200 of them. What they don't know is that John Watts being Dragon Canoe's nephew, I think, is in Notley town with 500 heavily armed warriors. And they hear John Sevier's coming. They're like, it's party time. And they come out to meet him. They're on the trail going down the river, and John Sevier's going up the river, and they see these guys, and they're like, ah! And they turn around and run. And it's a 3-day chase. John Sevier and his guys are going as hard as they can go. These Chickamauga warriors are right behind them, chase them up over the mountain, get to Unicoi Gap. They're so close in Unicoi Gap, they can hear the guys on both sides of them. I think the Americans can, reporting this. And then they get probably down into Coker Creek, and they got to stop. It gets dark. The Americans build fires, and they're sitting around like just scared out of their gourds. And the Chickamaugas are standing just out of firelight talking trash to them all night. In English, talking trash to them. First light of day, they're gone. John Sevier, they're going to Upper East Tennessee, and he's being chased by all these guys the whole way. So, they know each other, and all this is going on. But he jumps Hiwassee town with his guys, and they start killing people right away. People are making it into the river, and they're running them down. They've got canoes. They're going looking for people up and down under the banks. They find out there's people in the council house. Now, the council house is going to be a place the size of this theater, right? And it's where no violence is supposed to happen, right? There's people in the council house. Somebody apparently shoots out at them. They shoot back, and they just light it on fire. They burn everybody from the town that has taken refuge in that place. That's what this so-called warfare was like. That happened June 2nd of 1788. So on June 2nd of 1988, my whole crew wore black armbands for that one. For the 200th anniversary of that attack. One more attack. I know y'all are worn out with attacks. So this is 1793. And at this point, these guys, they're up around Knoxville. They are not supposed to be coming down here. They're not supposed to be attacking Cherokee folks. This was expressly illegal. These guys organized a group, Captain John Beard. This is reported in the Knoxville Gazette, by the way, as contemporary news. Organized a group. They come down. They go to Chestooey, they kill people at Chestooey. Then they go to Hiwassee, and here the Indians were, as they say, in blockhouses, meaning log cabins, and did not show themselves till white men approached very near, when they fired, killed one man by the name of Jeff Lowe, wounded another by the name of Manasco through the thigh. On this, they returned home precipitately, meaning they rode like hell, to get away from there. John Norton was in Hiwassee in 1809. He hears the same story from the Cherokee side. And they're like, yeah, we're sitting there, these guys are coming in, we're trying to figure out, what are we gonna do? They tied horses outside as decoys. So all these guys are like riding like crazy to try to be the first ones to steal these horses. And the folks will wait until they get close enough and then open up on them and scare them off. That's the last of those kinds of hostilities at Hiwassee that we know of. So for the folks at Hiwassee, that concludes the revolution. And what has happened in the interim is Cherokee folks have lost millions of acres of land, completely had all their communities disrupted and pushed to the south. So remember, at the beginning of the 18th century, Hiwassee was sort of the southern frontier of the Cherokee Nation. By this time, Hiwassee was the northern frontier. So it completely changed where Cherokee folks lived, trying to keep their settlements safe. And it was just this string of tragedy, and everybody was glad to see it over. Move through that. There's my sylvan view of Etowah in 1799 eyewitness account. So that's what a town around 1799 would have looked like when these two Moravians come through, Steiner and the Schweinitz, and they talk about visiting Hiwassee. And he said, they're saying that the town's on both sides of the river. They don't know that what's on the south side of the river is called Tennessee Town at that point. The valleys are full of corn and pumpkins and beans. Formerly, Hiwassee was a larger town, becoming smaller because of low-lying, unhelpful situation. Malaria got introduced in the interim, by the way. And most have moved away to Chestooey, but there's still 300 people on both sides of the river. Then when John Norton comes through in 1809, he says, really, the town has just sort of faded away. People are spread out there, but there's not a whole group of people there at Hiwassee anymore. The story doesn't stop there. It still remains part of Cherokee lands until 1819, until that treaty. And as part of that treaty, people could take reserves. Individual families could take reserves of 640 acres, supposedly sign up for the reserve, become American citizens, keep their 640 acres. And there were a couple of reserves at Hiwassee, and it was a mother and her daughter, Nellie and Wally Payne. Her husband was Thomas Payne, a white guy. And they took reserves. And then a white guy named Abraham Hurd, bought the place from the state of Tennessee, which didn't recognize the federal titles, and he came in and he destroyed their houses, chased them out, pulled their houses down, threw their houses in the river, and they rebuilt, and they threw them in the river again, and finally they just gave up, and that was the end of the last Cherokee folks to live at Hiwassee there, and it passed into Anglo-American hands. And there's just our aerial view of Hiwassee Old Town at the conclusion of everything. So I think what we could say just from looking at the documentary evidence and the archaeological evidence, this is the only one of the Chickamauga towns that's ever really been investigated. And what we see is not so much evidence of the hostility on this side. The one thing that we did see, I told you we love pottery, right? There was one house that had pieces of pottery that were Creek pottery. And we knew there were Creek families who had come in to help fight against the Americans. And so there was evidence of that level of resistance. But by and large, what we saw at Hiwassee and what we've seen repeatedly at Kukloe, at Watauga Town, where we've been working recently, is evidence of these expeditions just coming through time and time and time and time again. So the experience of Cherokee people 250 years ago was really kind of quite different from what we celebrate in the United States as our move toward independence. It was really the beginning of a whole process that ultimately leads to the deportation of Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation, because what's happening really from the very beginning, what William Drayton says he wants to do is move everybody, wipe them out, move them, open that land up, and ultimately that's what happens. Even though, you know, toward the end it's a little less violent, but that's what the whole trend was about. And I heard recently a podcast where somebody saying that was one of the main points of the revolution, was to open these lands up to grow this country. But the growth of our country, you know, it was not all happy. It was not all a fairy tale, you know, and it was, somebody had to pay, and that's what happened. So I'm going to stop there before I go way down in this hole. And I appreciate you being patient and tolerant with this, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. You'll kind of have to holler them at me for me to hear that, but I'll say thank you very much.